Like the others, I want to begin by expressing my appreciation to Austin Grad and to the other presenters. I have been here a number of times in years past as a participant, as one in full-time ministry, just taking it in. And when I was in full-time preaching and making this a regular event, it was such a Sabbath for me. And I know that really seems strange to even sometimes folks in the pew or maybe even your spouses. How can it be a Sabbath, driving, flying, spending 2, 3, 4 days, sitting, learning, studying, reading? You don't preach, do you? would be my response. To come to an event like this, and being a presenter has its own kind of stress, but that has been more than made up by the benefit I've received, listening, hearing, just being filled up at the feet of those presenting on the other topics. And wow, it is just rich. And if you haven't gone home with a few sermons from this, just God bless you. I don't know what to say, but this is so rich. And I want to particularly note that Glenn's presentations on the Lament Psalms are directly relevant to what we're going to discuss this hour, which is end-of-life issues, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. If you have the notes that I provided, I had a brief section on lament. After listening to Glenn, my suggestion would be to ignore my notes and look at his. Just amazing material. And as we think about theological reflection on suffering, obviously lament will be a very critical component. Before I launch into this topic, however, I want to recommend a website for you. And I not only recommend it, I highly, 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 highly recommend it. I was blessed to have resources provided for me to work on an MA in bioethics at Trinity International University and Divinity School in Deerfield in the Chicago suburbs. An amazing, enriching experience to be a part of that program that is multidisciplinary, diverse, philosophers, ethicists, theologians, physicians, other medical professionals, all teachers and leaders in that program, and to sit at their feet and to soak all of that in was an amazing experience over the years. And still, every end of June, coming up in a few weeks, I'll make the pilgrimage to the Trinity campus and take part in the Center for Bioethics annual ethics conference. And there will be a couple of hundred Christian professionals, doctors, nurses, attorneys, educators, ethicists, philosophers, who will gather on Trinity's campus for several days of discussing from a Christian perspective these critical issues. So the website is for the Center of Bioethics and Human Dignity, just cbhd.org. This is a screenshot of that website. This is a screenshot of the topic that we're going to be looking at today. So if you would access this site, there's a menu of topics. This is the first page on the end of life topic, and there are podcasts, there are articles, there are book reviews that number in probably the hundreds on each one of these topics. There are very, very, very many fine resources available via the web, but if I could recommend only one, this would be the site I would recommend. It gives you amazing material, but always from a Christian perspective. I recommend it highly, and I'm not getting any commercial endorsement fee for this. It's great. It's great. All right, to our topic for today. I can't really call it a cartoon. This picture, in my mind, captures the problem and the challenge that we wrestle with as ministers. And I, like you, long before I took a single course on bioethics, long before I started teaching at Harding, I was already well into wrestling with end-of-life issues, and you are too. It's one of those issues that you, as a minister, as an elder, as a church leader, will deal with. Maybe not with embryonic stem cell research, maybe not with cloning, maybe not with artificial reproductive technology, but you will deal with this regularly. I was in communication with a preacher from the Kerrville congregation who's a recent Harding graduate student that I had the privilege of getting to know well. And Jacob emailed me and said, I had planned to go, but I am snowed under with funerals this week and I just can't get away. And I thought, welcome to the life of ministry, where funerals sometimes come at inconvenient times when you want to get away to a Sabbath rest like this and can't. But all of that to remind us that we do deal with this. If you can read the small caption, here is Ralph hooked up on all of this medical technology, and the caption reads, "Thanks to the miracle of modern medicine, Ralph managed to live another 10 years." The question raised, should Ralph have lived another 10 years? Did Ralph want to live another 10 years? Are we obligated to keep Ralph alive another 10 years just because we can? And so there are a number of people who feel, ironically enough, that they're condemned to life. That they're ready to die. They're ready to be with the Lord. Have you had that conversation with folks? I have. A number of times when I've been visiting with a church member in the hospital, they've lived a good long life. They're at the end of their life. They're going to spend the rest of it more than likely in the hospital or a nursing home. And they have said to me more than once, Phil, I'm ready to die. I have lived faithfully for the Lord all of my life. I'm ready to close my eyes and wake up in His presence. But everyone wants me to stay on. Now, please don't misunderstand. They're not advocating euthanasia. They're not advocating suicide. But they are saying, I've lived a good life. I'm ready to enter into my reward. And then sometimes they'll say, my kids aren't ready. And they're saying, oh, Grandma, don't talk like that. Or Granddaddy, please, don't say things like that. But I'm ready. Would you, and I've even had this requested of me, would you please pray that the Lord would soon call me home, that I might lay aside this mortal coil and clothe myself with the garments of eternity. You've had those sacred conversations with your folks. So technology, as wonderful as it is, and I thank God for it. I've already let you know that my wife has been afflicted with Parkinson's disease since she was only 43 years old, and she has been able to sit through all of these long days. Sitting is the hardest thing for a Parkinson's patient to do. And yet, by the grace of God and the grace of physicians and scientists and pharmacologists who have, by their technological expertise, developed medicines and therapies, my wife, over 17 years in this disease, is still doing reasonably well by the grace of God, but also by the help of technology. So, don't hear any of this as being anti-tech. I'm not. I'm for medical technology that ameliorates human suffering, that cures diseases, that give people hope that right now have no hope. I really believe we're going to cure Alzheimer's one day. I believe we're going to cure Parkinson's one day. I would pray my wife would live long enough to see that cure. Only God knows if she will. But I think those days are coming, and thank God when they come. But right now, for all of its benefits, technology has created a significant problem. That there are times when we are condemned to life, when we are caught in the in-between of a healthy, vibrant life with full quality and this horrible disease or injury that just won't let go. Clark and Rakestraw, in their very important book on Christian ethics, have this observation. Today, medicine can delay death. In spite of its power, however, medicine cannot destroy death. In fact, it sometimes leaves patients in a twilight between life and death. These conflicting realities, the power of medicine to cure and the inevitability of death, give impetus to a pressing ethical question: how should we care for terminal patients? Well, one day I will be one of those patients. Unless I die suddenly of an accident or an acute injury or illness, I will be one of those patients who is wrestling in the twilight between life and death, wanting to go on and be with the Lord, yet being against suicide, loving life, yet also anticipating an eternity, and trying to know when is my time, which I would argue theologically is like asking, when is it God's time for me? And trying to figure that out. So we will wrestle with it personally, but you are wrestling with it now in ministry, every one of you. And you are also wrestling with it personally as you deal with your parents, as you deal, God forbid, one day with your own spouse, or heaven forbid, with your own children. Just recently, we had a young man connected to Harding who suddenly died and collapsed on an evening run. He was actually on the cross-country team at his high school and collapsed on an evening run, was caught in that in-between, hooked up on all kinds of machines and technologies, and I'm in long-distance correspondence with the parents, and they're asking, Phil, what do we do? What do we do? And finally, the decision was made to shut down the machines and to let this young man, even at the unbelievably young age of 16, to die and to be with the Lord. Those are heart-wrenching decisions, as you know, but they're decisions that we assist people with in ministry regularly. Well, we're going to talk about euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. We're going to lay out some definitions and terminology before we jump into biblical teaching and theology. And I'm glad to say, wow, I have a lot more on this from the Bible this time than sometimes we have had with these other issues. I'm now feeling like a preacher on this one. I've got a book, chapter, and verse we can go to, and I'm liking that a lot better. But to lay some foundation, euthanasia literally means a good death, which immediately raises the theological question for me, from a Christian perspective, what is a good death? Now, if you ask Jack Kevorkian and Derek Humphrey and James Rachels and these leading proponents of voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, they define good death as, you already know this, a good death is a death free from what? Pain and suffering. That to them is the sum of it. A good death is a death free of pain and suffering, and we might add that you have control over. So the movement in voluntary active euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, is we have a right to die, which we'll try to unpack a little bit later. It seems like an odd expression to me. But we have a right to die. We have the right to choose when, how, under what circumstances. And also I have a right to demand medical assistance to facilitate my death. And it's motivated by freedom from pain and suffering. So I would begin with this homiletical hint. This will preach, and it needs to be preached. So I want to preach a sermon on, however you title it, the point of it is, what is a good death from a biblical perspective? And I would argue in this sermon, it's not necessarily a death free from pain and suffering, and there are examples abounding in Scripture. We, of course, could go to the death of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, as you know, as well as I, died a death of excruciating horror, unbelievable pain, unspeakable sorrow. But I'm not going to say that Jesus died a bad death. I want to argue Jesus died a good death even in the midst of suffering and pain. And this is where Glenn's material is so critical to this discussion as well. as Jesus laments in the Garden of Gethsemane, but as he also gives himself fully to the will of God, not my will, but yours be done. Or in John 12, when Jesus cries out, now has my hour come. Now, Father, is the hour by which you will be glorified. It was the hour of his death, that appointed hour that he would die for our salvation. I want us to pick up on that language of glorification and suggest in this sermon that a good death is a death that glorifies God by one's faithful and obedient submission, even in the midst of pain and sorrow and suffering. Not despite it, but in the midst of it. Or you could preach easily from the example of the Apostle Paul. I give you some texts you might consider. Particularly, I find helpful Philippians chapter 1, verse 21 through 26. It reminds me of the conversation with that good Christian sister or brother in the hospital who says, Phil, I'm ready to die. I mean, I'm not going to hasten it. I'm not going to take my own life. I don't want anyone else to take my life, but I'm ready to die. Is that an unchristian thought to say that? I don't think so. Paul's saying it in Philippians 1. He says, I would rather depart and be with Christ, which is far better. So Paul reached a point in his life when he was able to say, right now, being in the presence of God sounds pretty good. But then he goes on to say, but it is necessary that I remain for your sake. And Paul remained. Paul fought on. Paul continued to be faithful. Paul continued to preach. He continued to plant churches. He continued to lead. He continued to face the sufferings that were his as an apostle of Christ. But he says, I'm ready. I'm ready. But I'm also ready to stay if the Lord requires and needs. I think that is such a healthy biblical attitude toward death, that I'm not going to rush it. I'm not the one who determines the beginning and end of life. That's God's decision, not mine. But I'm ready, but I'm also willing to remain. I, in this sermon, would bring up contemporary examples, obviously with people's permission to do so. I would never surprise a person by bringing them up, probably in any sermon, but particularly not in this sermon. I learned that the hard way when, after a sermon one day, my own daughter said, I was used to bringing them up in my sermons when they were little kids. I mean, your kids are the best in the world, the best sermon illustrations you've got. And finally, Jessie got old enough after church one day on the way home. She said, Daddy, you talked about me in your sermon. Well, I talked favorably about you. She says, I know you did, Daddy. But I'd really like for you to ask before you do that. And so I just made that my rule after that. I would say, hey, Jesse, John, Shannon, or Liz, would it be okay if I shared this in the sermon? All right, so when I'm preaching this, I'm going to tell the story of Pam. And there are dozens more I could tell. Pam was a godly Christian woman who died of breast cancer in her early 40s. But in my opinion, she died a good death. And it was one of those sacred moments. If you've been there, you know it's a sacred moment. When I was actually in the hospital room, when Pam breathed her last and went on to be with the Lord. I was there when the machines went flat. When Pam breathed one heavy breath and went on to eternity. Some of her kids were members of a Christian a cappella group, Free Indeed. They're not singing so much now, but they were popular then. And Free Indeed was there around the table just minutes before Pam's death. And she had been out of it. I stayed there that day a couple of hours, and she had been out of it for a while. And all of a sudden, it's just like she jerked up in bed, and she's looking off. I'll let you decide what to make of this. I witnessed it, that's all I know. She jerked up and she said, I see angels. I see angels coming to get me. I'm not seeing the angels. Did Pam see the angels? I'm not saying she didn't. she sure thought she did. I don't know. I've not passed that veil between life and death. Pam was. And then it was just a few minutes after that, while we're gathered around her bed singing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, that Pam, her children started crying. I started crying because we were sad. We're going to miss Pam. But in an odd way, in the midst of that pain, we're also smiling at the life of this unbelievably faithful, godly woman who was faithful not just when life was good, but was faithful in her cancer, was faithful to the last day that she had upon the earth. This doesn't always happen, but her oncologist came to the funeral that I preached for Pam. And after the funeral, well-known oncologist in Little Rock, and after the funeral, her oncologist said, I need to talk to you. I said, well, what's on your mind? And he said, unfortunately in my job, I see a lot of death. More of my patients die than live. And unfortunately, I've had hundreds of patients die. But I have never, in all my years of being an oncologist, I've just never witnessed a woman dying like this woman died. I want you to tell me what it is. And the answer's two words, right? Jesus Christ. Of course, it means a great deal beyond that as well. And I said, it's her Christian faith that allows her to live victoriously, but also die a good death. I would also suggest in your sermons to make sure you distinguish pain and suffering. Advocates of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are focused only on physical pain. For the most part. I would suggest from a Christian perspective, we have a lot of help we can give on the notion of suffering, which I would suggest is the interpretation of one's pain. So we've all had this experience where, as far as we can tell, people seem to be kind of in the midst of a similar disease or the same extent of suffering, and they're handling it very differently. So the suffering, the interpretation of that pain, that might be the emotional grief or the social sense of isolation or the spiritual search for meaning that Glenn and others have talked about so poignantly, or it could be just concerns about the financial ends of being ill and dying. You've had those conversations where people, particularly it seems men, have said to me, Phil, my greatest concern after I die, it's not, dying, I'm going to be with the Lord. It's whether my wife and kids are going to be able to make it financially after I die. I've tried to provide for them. I've tried to do the best I can. And I have that deep concern that they're going to be okay financially and that the bills are going to get paid and they're going to be all right. So the suffering can have many dimensions, but to make sure that we deal with that perhaps as well. All right, we've got to deal with some definitions before we move on. What the conversation about is right now is voluntary active euthanasia. And you see the distinctions. Voluntary at the patient's request, as opposed to we don't know what the patient desires, as opposed to we know what they desire and we're going to act against them. Now, this may be unbelievable to you, but there are actually some philosophers arguing right now for the ethical requirement of involuntary euthanasia, arguing on utilitarian grounds that we just can't support all of these dying people. Most of your healthcare dollars are spent in the last 5 or 10 years of your life. We can't afford that as a society. There are philosophers seriously arguing there needs to be a mandatory checkout age of, say, 80, 85, which in your 40s sounds, oh yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. When you're nearly 60, 80 sounds really young, okay? No, I don't like that, all right? And but folks are arguing that, but for the most part, thank God they're not getting any traction. So, right now anyway. So the discussion, and I want to suggest now what I'll stress in a minute. to me, the most single critical task you have in teaching and preaching about this is distinguishing in your own mind and then helping your members distinguish in their minds the difference between active euthanasia and what has regrettably been called passive euthanasia. I'm going to suggest a much better way to term it in a minute. Well, active euthanasia, what is being argued now by some, it ought to be legalized in the U.S. as it's been legalized in 4 other countries, is acting to cause death. In active euthanasia, the physician is a causal agent in the death in the sense he or she will provide, not just provide, he or she will enact the medical means that is the medical cause of your death. So typically in active euthanasia, it would be the physician herself or himself injecting you with a lethal dose that will end your life in the next 90 seconds. You may have cancer, you may have ALS, you may have some other disease, but what is going to end your life is this injection. And it'll end it in the next 90 seconds. That is currently illegal, thank God, in all 50 states. Voluntary active euthanasia, illegal right now in the U.S. Will it always be? Well, maybe to some extent that depends on us and our voice in the public arena. Passive euthanasia. All right, this is where the conversation gets tough, and this is where we can really leave wrong impressions and be misunderstood, but I think in our preaching and teaching, this is where the conversation must be. I do not like the term passive euthanasia because it still has euthanasia in it, and people hear that and they think something else. So I would suggest terming it differently, and I prefer these 2 terms, either the term letting die. You know, the notion is we're not killing someone, we're simply backing off and letting what? Letting the natural progress of the disease or injury take its natural course. So that they don't die of my last lethal act, they die of the disease or they die of the injury. We've simply reached a point where further medical treatment is physiologically or qualitatively futile. You know, there's nothing we can do to cure this disease. There might be something we could do to buy a few more days or a few more weeks. But is that justified in the light of the present circumstances, perhaps? So in passive euthanasia, or again, I prefer letting die, or if you really want to get clumsy with it, choosing not to prolong the dying process. You know, medical technology, it lets us stretch that dying process out over weeks or months or even years. So acting not to prolong or choosing not to prolong the dying process so that they die of the underlying disease or injury. Now, that there are morally relevant differences between active euthanasia and letting die is upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Not that they always get it right, in my opinion, but I think they do on this one. It's upheld by the majority of Christian ethicists and by many, many, many non-Christian ethicists. About the only exceptions are the utilitarians. Don't have time for that conversation now. And also by the vast majority of medical professionals. So here, in my judgment, are the 2 ethical distinctions of importance. One is difference between active euthanasia and letting die or choosing not to prolong the dying process. It's at the level of intention. What is my intention? When I withdraw medical treatment, when I decide cure is no longer possible, we are unnecessarily prolonging the dying process, so we're going to cut off the machines, or we're going to cut down this therapy, or we're not going to do this particular thing. What is our intention? Is our intention to kill them? I hope not. Or is our intention merely, I hope so, not wanting to prolong their suffering and agony beyond what the injury, the disease, or death requires? Just, is there ever a time when we surrender to the disease and let the disease, by the providence of God, run its natural course? And I say there is, when you make that decision. Secondly, it's critical to me ethically, what is the cause of death? Is the medical cause of death the lethal act of the physician, or is it the disease or injury that underlies the medical condition? Now, this thing of intention is really slippery, because unless you know the hearts of people like Jesus, how do you know? All right. Here's how I would know. Both my mom and dad died after struggling with disease for a long time. So in my dad's case, he reached a point where it seemed that medical intervention had become futile. We were willing to back off. And so let's say this is removed or that's not done. And if he went on living another many months, which he did, but my attitude was not, oh man, I was sure hoping Dad would die, And I'm going to tell you, some people do hope their daddy would die. Why? That is exactly, thank you for being, because they see their inheritance being burned up in expensive medical bills. And if their heart could be revealed, that's exactly what they're hoping. All right? I was amazed. My dad is a tough old Kentucky bird, okay? So he just went on living for more months. My mama lived, bless her heart, she lived at least 18 months, 2 years after they said she was going to die this weekend. So both mom and dad surprised the medical folks. So, the Lord knows your heart. Principle of double effect is also real critical in this whole discussion, and here's how it plays out at the end of life. So one day it may be you, one day it may be your loved one who has an illness that at this point can't be cured, but you do want to relieve their pain and suffering. So the principle of double effect will often be part of the conversation when, all right, we could relieve some of the pain and suffering by increasing the pain medication that we give you or your loved one, but there is the possibility of foreseeing what? That as we increase this very strong analgesic, that theoretically what could happen? It might, now it won't kill him. I would argue if it's going to kill him in the next 20, in the next minute, I would say no. But theoretically, it could shorten their length of days upon earth by, hours, days, weeks, maybe months. Well, can you do that? Can you act with a good intention of easing their pain, knowing that theoretically it might lessen their days on earth? This comes to us through natural law ethics. I personally believe under the right circumstances, the double effect principle can be embraced by Christian ethics. So if a good act has two effects, one good and one bad, a person can act morally in doing the good act, provided only the good effect is intended, the bad effect is not the means to the good effect, and the good effect is at least equal to the bad effect. Now, active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide fail by the double effect criteria. The notion of letting die passes the criteria if death is imminent, if death is caused by the disease or injury and not your act, and if your intention is to care for, that is to relieve suffering, not to cause the death. So that raises this critical question, which also needs to be addressed in your preaching, teaching, and in your own thinking about this. Is the Christian committed to a position that is called vitalism? Vitalism is the position that doing everything possible to squeeze out every possible second of life is ethically required no matter the medical circumstances. Does being a pro-life Christian require a commitment to vitalism? When cure is no longer possible, Are we required? Are we obligated by our Christian character, virtues, and principles to just say, I know I'm never going to be better. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. I want to stress, I'm against suicide. I'm against VAE. I'm against PAS. But am I obligated to do this and 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 this? Just so it gives me a few more hours or days. And I want to suggest not necessarily so. I'm against VAE. I am against PAS. I am against hastening our death. But I want to suggest that one of the roles that suffering plays in our life is it provides the means by which, here's how I picture it. All right, we're holding on to life because life is so precious. We want to have every day we can, but we're also reaching up to eternity. And I want to suggest that suffering and pain is part of God's providential mechanism where at some point we're able to go, those are tough decisions. I never want to make them for anyone else. Those are tough decisions. My mom died of cancer. I took her to Portsmouth Naval Hospital the day she met with her physician team after they ran some tests. And I was sitting beside her holding her hand when her cancer doctor said, Miss Thompson, we've got bad news. The tests reveal that your cancer has, it's spread. It's in your brain now. And this is what you might expect in the course of... we can't do any more radiation, which we tried to stop it with radiation, but we didn't. Now, we could try some chemo. The problem is chemo is really not effective for the kind of cancer you have. The odds of it doing any good, he kind of went like this. The odds of it doing any good are about like this. And as soon as he said that, what did my mom start doing? She started going like this. And then she just said, no more, no more, no more. Was my mom obligated to say yes to chemo just because it might give her another few weeks on earth? I would argue no. Not even from a pro-life Christian perspective. It was her time. It was her time. We went back to the house I grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, and we sat under the mimosa tree, hold hands, prayed together, and my mom said, Phil, I guess I'm going to die, aren't I? I said, Mom, it looks like that. Only God knows. And God will determine the time. But we're going to be with you all through that time. We're not going to leave you. We're going to be with you. And I can't tell this story without saying this. There are times when the church disappoints. This is not one of those times. The church at Granby Street in Norfolk, Virginia, when my mom was dying over the period of several months, it was the church at the best I have ever seen the church personally. My mom had personal, round-the-clock care by church members who loved my mom. Some were Christian nurses. Some were just members who didn't have any medical expertise, but they said, we can come sit with your mom. So they would let my dad or other caregivers, my wife spent weeks and weeks there as well, said, we're going to let you rest and we're going to take care of Betty. And for months and months and months that went on with church members loving my mom, helping my mom, serving my mom in Christ-like ways. The church at the very best I've ever seen it. I want to suggest, and I know this is controversial, that being a pro-life Christian does not require a commitment to vitalism. Now, we must be against voluntary active euthanasia. We must be against physician-assisted suicide. But I don't think we have to be for vitalism. I think there are times we can say, as has been argued this week, enough. I fought the good fight. The cancer has won. The ALS has won. I'm ready to be with the Lord. No more chemo. Take me off the artificial ventilation and just let me be with God. I think that time comes. So what's being debated now? It's obvious as you look at the time, we ain't finishing this. I appreciate your patience with me. When I teach these topics at school, I have 3 to 5 hours on each. I've been trying to pick and choose and sometimes doing poorly. The debate today is on voluntary active euthanasia, as I've already said, illegal in all 50 states. Also being debated is physician-assisted suicide, which is now legal in the 4 states you see: Oregon and Washington by ballot, Montana by court, Vermont by legislature. Oregon was the first state, 1998. And since 1998, this was as of 2011, so the numbers are higher, 935 patients had had lethal prescriptions written by their doctors, and 596 patients had ingested those drugs and died as a result of them. When I'm preaching on this, I want to be aware of this. When you ask these patients in Oregon and Washington, what were the reasons you requested lethal drugs through Dying with Dignity acts? And these were the 3 top reasons: decreasing ability to enjoy life, loss of autonomy, and loss of dignity. So I'm going to want to deal with these in my sermons. And I'm wanting to suggest in those sermons that we may be missing the Christian dimension of death and dying. That it's very personal, so it's about me in that sense. But it's not just about me. It's about other critical concerns that relate to the kingdom of God. So when I preach this sermon, homiletical hints, I want to make sure I distinguish the operational differences between VAE and PAS. In VAE, the doctor actually injects the lethal drug. That's still illegal in the U.S. In PAS, the doctor writes the lethal script, you get it filled at this pharmacy, you go home and you take it, you die at home. So I want to stress the differences, but also the ethical similarities. And the ethical similarities are, you are taking death into your own hands instead of leaving it in God's hands. I tell you what, I give information for you on the 2 arguments, argument from mercy, argument from autonomy in the notes. So I hate to do it, but I love Keith and we're friends. I don't want him to be angry with me. So I'm gonna move on and let you look at my responses to that in your notes and give you my theological reflection as we close out. So, case against. 1, the notion of God's role in life and death, that God determines the beginning and ending of life. The notion of sanctity of human life. And this particularly important one that I would do a lot of preaching on, from a Christian perspective, suffering may be redemptive. That we've looked at Philippians 1, where Paul might have preferred death, but he chose to live. In James chapter 1, count it all joy, my brothers, when you experience trials of various sorts, because you know these trials produce steadfastness, and steadfastness, when it has its full work, makes you perfect in Christ. And I argue in a sermon on James 1, the joy there is not some kind of masochistic joy of bring it on. The joy is the eschatological joy of the kingdom of God. And because of that joy, we are willing to be steadfast even in the midst of suffering. Or suffering helps to prepare the sufferer for eternity. Paul in this text with which you're familiar, he says these afflictions we've experienced in Asia and all over the place, they have helped us see that they pale in comparison to the eternity that awaits. So putting that suffering in perspective. The slippery slope is a dangerous ethical argument, but in this case, I think the slippery slope is actually slippery. And so there seems to be evidence of a movement from the right to die to a duty to die, at least among some philosophers I read. And in some members you will minister to, who will beat around the bush saying, I'm almost made to feel I ought to check out as soon as possible. They're being made to feel that by their own family sometimes. All right, no one's for that. No one's for that. All right. Distortion of doctor-patient relationship. And then to end with these quick principles that you can preach from as well as I. The human being in the image of God. God determines the beginning and end of life, not I. We've already critiqued self-autonomy and determination. Responding to suffering, we've already looked at. Preferring death, but deciding to live. And then longing for the redemption of our bodies in Jesus. So this is where I'm going to be doing most of my preaching on this. And the great news is, if you don't believe me, I'm just going to go through these. The great news is we have lots of biblical texts, right? We have lots of biblical text on this. And we have all of the wonderful material on lament that we have been given by Glenn. The resources are rich on this topic to help you and to help your loved ones and to help the sick and dying in your church and in your community to die a good death, a death that glorifies God by being faithful even in the midst of pain and suffering. May God bless you in that critical ministry. You'll be there long after the physician leaves the room. You will even sometimes be there after the family leaves the room. And you will be that minister, you will be that elder, you will be that confidant who this person will say, well, I haven't had time to talk to the doctor about this. And I can't talk to my family about this. They're just not willing to hear it. Brother Phil, can I talk to you about this? And you're going to say, of course, Sister Sue. Of course, Brother Bill, you can. And they're going to pour out their heart. And they're going to break. And they're going to cry. And you're going to hold their hands. And you're going to enter into this sacred covenant of prayer. And you're going to say, Dear God, among other things, pray for us to know when it is your time. May we not rush it, because this is your will, not ours. But may we also accept it when it becomes clear that it is my time to die. It is my time to die. It is my time to die. God, give us the wisdom and the grace to bear that moment and to minister in the lives of people facing that moment. God bless you in that good work.